La Gran Renuncia es auspiciado por Workation Planet, la agencia de retiros empresariales en los mejores entornos rurales de la Argentina. Si eres gerente de una empresa remota o híbrida, te ayudamos a fortalecer la conexión entre tus colaboradores compartiendo experiencias grupales únicas en un entorno de plena naturaleza. Y si eres nómada digital, te invitamos a sumarte a nuestra comunidad para descubrir los mejores destinos de Argentina mientras trabajas. Ingresa a www.workationplanet.co y entérate de todo lo que tenemos para ofrecerte. Workation Planet te invita a disfrutar el siguiente episodio de La Gran Renuncia.
Bienvenidos a un nuevo capítulo de La Gran Renuncia. Nuestro invitado de hoy es Robert Longley. Robert tiene más de 35 años de experiencia diversificada que incluyen reingeniería de procesos comerciales, gestión de proyectos, gestión de cambios organizacionales, desarrollo e implementación de software y capacitación y consultoría en tecnología de la información. Comparte su conocimiento sobre el futuro del trabajo en un newsletter semanal que denomina Going Remote First.
Bienvenidos a La Gran Renuncia, claves para una gerencia remota.
Robert, bienvenido y gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Robert, tú trabajas con temas de reevaluar el futuro del trabajo y también con temas de comunidades sustentables. ¿Están ambas relacionadas y en tal caso, de qué manera se relacionan?
In my mind, they're related. You know, the way that we work and where we work definitely has an impact on the environment. You know, you know buildings in cities have a carbon footprint, whether people are in them or not. And when we commute, we obviously impact the environment as well. So your situation in Argentina is quite a bit different than ours in the United States. You typically have about 30% of your population commutes to work by car, whereas here in the United States, it's over 70%. So when people have switched to remote work, it makes, I think, a bigger difference than it does in certain other places. And different countries have different profiles in terms of what the impact is on the environment versus remote work. Um, yeah.
Trabajaste como gerente de proyectos por muchos años en diferentes compañías. ¿En qué momento empezaste a tener interés en el trabajo de manera remota?
I've gone back and forth between working remote and working in offices over the years. I first worked remote in the late 1990s. I worked for an entrepreneur who was based in Norway, and he had houses in Florida and the Cayman Islands, and I never knew what time zone he was going to be in. And we did have a local office. I went into the office one day a week, so kind of an early model for hybrid, because it was about an hour and a half from my house, and got very comfortable working in that model. It was kind of fun with him because you sometimes you would do meetings at 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 8 o'clock at night, depending on what the need was. And during that time, one of the things that people have found during the pandemic was that they were able to do more stuff with family. And at that time, my daughter was, I think, in kindergarten, and being able to work remote allowed me to teach kindergartners how to use a computer, which I actually enjoyed doing quite a bit. So, having an asynchronous work schedule and a work life can allow you to do a lot of things that, doing the traditional 9 to 5 doesn't. So, fast forward, mostly I was in a corporate environment. I do a lot of stuff in government. And really, just since the pandemic, I've been fully remote. I do government consulting for a couple of different states, and there really just isn't. I've been to the office once, I think, in the last 3 years, just because they wanted me to speak at a conference. But other than that, the need to be in the office for a lot of things just doesn't apply anymore. And that's something that a lot of CEOs are struggling with right now because they think we've got to get people back into the office. And the reality is that people tend to be more productive at outside of the office. So they just have to look at the right data.
Rob, ¿y nos podrías hablar acerca del concepto de rampa que vos utilizás en uno de los artículos de tu newsletter referido al trabajo remoto, ¿no? Y bueno, me interesaba mucho traerlo a colación en este episodio.
Sure. The for people who aren't familiar with the idea of a curb cut, it it is exactly what it says. It's a cut in the curb on sidewalks, and this started being done probably 50 years ago, making sidewalks more accessible for handicaps. So it's kind of been a, I don't know if the term is used in Argentina much, but it it is an accommodation to deal primarily with handicapped people, but the concept of a curb cut applies to a lot of different things. And I view remote work as one of those things because remote work has made it a lot easier for handicapped people in particular to be employed. The percentage of people with disabilities has gone up dramatically as a result of them being able to work remotely. Coming into an office, even with accommodations, can be difficult in terms of transportation. And I don't know if we have what's called the Americans with Disabilities Act that requires certain structural things to be done to buildings to accommodate people with disabilities. But even with those, it can be challenging for them to get to meetings, get around an office, get on public transportation, whatever it is. And if in their homes, they have typically set up their environment so they work the way that they work best. So by leveraging remote work for for disabled people, um, you have you've basically created something by making things work better for them. You've made something that works better for other people as well. So some of the things you saw um, in terms of, I don't know if you use the term diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion as much. People in a variety of minority groups have found that they feel more connected uh, by doing stuff remotely than they are in the office. There's actually a thing called height discrimination that if you look it up. So people who are taller tend to be received perceived as being more in power. So, taller people tend to get promoted more. On a Zoom screen, everybody's the same size. So it's a great equalizer. You also have women of a variety of ages that tend to leave the workforce, even though they are qualified for upper management positions, just because they can't balance, the responsibilities of family and work together. And it's primarily because women bear the larger percentage of those responsibilities in most families. So you have typically a lot of times women who will sacrifice their career for their family. And again, remote work, by having a distributed model and being flexible, they're allowed it that flexibility gets them the opportunity to participate in the workforce and handle their home responsibilities as well. And I know, don't just limit this to women. Um, in my own case, my father required care earlier this year. He made it to 93, living by himself and taking care of himself. But one day he just couldn't do it anymore and didn't want to go into a hospital or a nursing home. And my brother and I were able to take care of him for his last months in the setting that he wanted to. So, that's something that I would not have been able to do, working a 9 to 5 job just because he required 24-hour care. There's lots of examples like that where um, by offering remote work as an option for one group, many other groups have benefited from it as well. So that's why it's kind of referred to as a curb cut. I don't know if there's a an equivalent translation in Spanish for that, but that's where the term comes from.
Bien, ¿y cuál es tu opinión acerca del micromanagement?
Sure. Um, Again, that is a in the office, it probably wasn't as obvious, but the same people who are likely to manage in the office are more likely to do it outside of the office because um, so often, people's idea of management is walking around and making sure people are sitting at their desks. And when they can't do that, they tend to look for monitoring tools like in Microsoft Teams, for instance. If you are set up as part of a team, you can basically see when the last time somebody moved their mouse. And I, I actually dealt with somebody who that's pretty much all he did all day long was watch that to see when a particular team member last moved his mouse. You have no idea what they're actually doing, but that was his indicator that they were doing nothing, which is really kind of stupid. You really have to look in terms of, and this is where um, when you're working remote, you've got to establish um, objectives and um, just kind of uh, outcomes that somebody's going to be working on, because if you're trying to watch them 24/7 and see what they're doing, you're always going to think that they're doing nothing, and it's a waste of everybody's time. The other problem with micromanagement is that in those situations, if you're trying to constantly check on what somebody's doing, you're interrupting them at the same time, and it takes the average person about 20 minutes to get back into the groove of what they're doing when they've been interrupted. So if you're watching somebody online and with monitoring tools and trying to determine that whether they're doing something or not, and then you contact them to see, why haven't you moved your mouse in the last 30 minutes? You've just interrupted them. They may have been doing something perfectly legitimate, um, but now you've interrupted them, and it's going to take them another 20 minutes to get back into the groove of what they're doing. So you know some of
Sí.
the things that you want to try and avoid. The problem that a lot of companies run into is that they try to apply the same policies and procedures that they had in the office to a remote setting, and it doesn't work that way. This is You've got to look at how are people going to work remotely and apply it back into the office. If you can get policies and procedures that work for people regardless of where they're working, um, then that will work in the office as well. But if you try to establish the same standards that you might have had for people being in the office in terms of clocking in at a certain time, clocking out at a certain time, taking breaks at a certain time, um, you'll quickly frustrate everybody, and that's why you're seeing companies that are pushing these return to office mandates, seeing relatively high attrition, with people going, no, don't want to do it anymore, or they're starting to look for companies that are more receptive than others. I don't know if you have the same problems or the same level of this problem in Argentina as in the U.S., because you have a much higher occupancy rate for your buildings than we do currently. Um, After the pandemic, typical office buildings in the United States are only at about 50% occupancy, and yours in Argentina are actually closer to 85% occupancy. So you have a different issue than we do with stuff. We also, we have a higher percentage of people um, uh, using cars for transportation. So the the way we commute is different than you are, and probably it's when we move towards remote work, it was something that people noticed more when they didn't need to commute because they, weren't driving their car as much. There were cities that the smog basically cleared when the pandemic happened because people weren't driving their cars nearly as much. So lots of changes.
Sí, exacto. Hay en Argentina, como dices, mayor ocupación de las oficinas, pero sin duda ha habido un cambio en la tendencia, como indicas. La gente vio que hay muchas ventajas, como el ejemplo que mencionaste con tu papá. Igual ocurre que personas que tienen responsabilidad de gente mayor o niños en casa prefieren trabajar en empresas que le permiten el esquema híbrido o 100% remoto.
Actually
Y
have higher rates of people working remote than the United States does. You're typically around 44%, and
Ujú.
the U.S. is in the 30s, depending on who you talk to. There's a lot of manipulated statistics because people who own a lot of commercial real estate are in danger of losing quite a bit of money because of the vacancy problem. They overbuilt in a lot of major cities like Boston and New York, and um, they are looking for people to come back to the office, and it's never going to happen. They've got to really start looking at alternatives use for that space. Whereas you seem to have a much better handle on your space utilization for commercial real estate than the US does at this time.
Sí, y hay un llamado de regreso a las empresas, por ejemplo, Zoom. Y es curioso que una empresa como esta, que controla el mercado de las aplicaciones para reuniones a distancia, esté llamando a la presencialidad en las oficinas y, como mencionas, debe estar relacionado a la inversión que hicieron en estructuras, edificios, oficinas, ¿no?
I think so. There was I was just looking at there was a company that was profiled this morning called Rob I'm not familiar with it, other than they have a metaverse platform, and it's basically a gaming platform. It's designed for distributed use, and they just did a return to office mandate. And it's like their their tagline for what they provide in the let me look it up again quick. Um, oops, my keyboard's not working right now, but their their um, their their marketing slogan basically totally goes against what they're doing in terms of forcing people back into the office. So you see a lot of things like that where like with Zoom and the Meta, who has Facebook, they just paid several $1 million. It's the equivalent of 7 years on a lease of a building in England to get out of the lease because they've realized that they weren't going to ever occupy the space. They're still trying to get people back into the offices, but they've got less offices for people to go back to, which is also interesting. You're going to start seeing more of that. You, the mandates might continue, but the amount of space that's available is going to go down.
Aparte de la razón del monto invertido en oficinas y del riesgo que esa inversión pierda valor, ¿crees que hay otras razones que llaman a las personas a regresar a las oficinas?
Um, the argument that keeps coming up is that people collaborate better in the office, and that's kind of a fallacy. People collaborate better in person, and that's what is really kind of the missing piece for a lot of CEOs. They need to see that and I'm all for people getting together in person, but when was the last time you had valuable interactions in an office settings? Usually it's after work at an offsite or something. Most of the time spent in your typical cubicle farm office is just doing work, and the same stuff happens on a regular basis. You've got the guys that are hanging out drinking coffee. People might have casual conversations with you going past your desk, but for the most part you're trying to get work done. and many times those things are just interruptions. So you've got companies like Allstate and PricewaterhouseCooper that just abandon their offices pretty much altogether, and doing it very quietly. They're sitting on the sidelines reaping the benefits of no longer having major offices, watching their competition just sort of flounder. So it's rare that you'll see there are a few that have come out and basically said how good they're doing remote. But for the most part, the ones that are doing it are kind of staying quiet and waiting for their competition to fall by the wayside.
Otro de los artículos que leí tuyos, Rob, es ese que afirma que se da por supuesto de que si uno está en la oficina, si el equipo está junto en la oficina, verdaderamente está junto, ¿no? Verdaderamente está conectado. ¿Nos puedes hablar un poquito de todo el razonamiento que haces en ese artículo? Si te gusta nuestro contenido, te pedimos que nos ayudes a difundirlo siguiéndonos en Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube o desde la plataforma que nos estés escuchando. También puedes suscribirte a nuestro newsletter podcastlagranrenuncia@gmail.com y te haremos llegar todas las novedades acerca de gerenciamiento y trabajo remoto. Seguimos escuchando La Gran Renuncia.
Yeah, there's a lot of what you're going to start seeing a lot more in companies is a lot more retreats and co-working space type events where people are trying to be intentional in their interactions. Most people, again, in an office setting, it's um, it's a place to do work, but it doesn't necessarily improve the work being done, and that's what a lot of companies are finding. So, right now, the occupancy nationwide for office buildings is, I think, around 52% in the United States, but the utilization is even less than that. I think it's in the high 20s. So a lot of commercial real estate leases based on timing, at least in the United States and I guess in Europe too. A lot of them are going to be, those leases are going to be expiring in the next 2 years. And traditionally, you had leases that were 5, 10, 15, sometimes even 20 years. I think News Corp just was the most recent to do a 20-year lease in in New York City, but nobody's going to be doing that anymore. So you're going to start seeing companies that had these large spaces starting to change the spaces that they have and getting smaller spaces that typically have less desks, more meeting space, and specialized meeting space. So rooms with whiteboards, rooms with more comfortable furniture, stuff like that, so that they, as they start to embrace that hybrid is the way that they're going, um, they are creating spaces that they are better used for collaboration. It's not just your desk, you store your stuff there, and your buddy is in the next cubicle over. Now when people are going to be coming into the offices, it's going to be more of an intentional collaboration. And for companies that don't necessarily have their own office, you're going to see more in the way of co-working spaces. You may be familiar with the company WeWork, which they overinvested in their urban locations, and there's some other problems there. So they will probably implode within the next few months. But it doesn't mean the model is dead. They're one of their competitors, Ravis, um, has been doing very well in more suburban markets. And that is, I think, what you're going to see more. You're going to see co-working spaces that are actually located closer to where workers might be, rather than having people come into centralized locations, like office towers and stuff like it has been in the past. And those spaces are going to be have amenities. They're going to be architecturally designed. They're not just, cubicles for you to sit with a Wi-Fi password. They're going to be nice spaces with amenities, so that it's designed to, enhance the experience of getting together. You're also going to see more companies doing retreats and gathering. Doist is one company that is doing this extensively, and they're kind of famous for their retreats that they do with their entire company. Not everybody's going to take this approach, but if you right now the um, average person costs anywhere from I think 11 to $17,000 a year to provide a dedicated office for a person. If you don't need to do that, you can start saving that quite a bit and get your costs down dramatically. Now, it might be tempting for companies to just save all of that money, but save half of it and use the other half for creating events that help promote your culture. Because companies that are forcing mandates are having a retention problem. People are like, yeah, I don't want to do it anymore, so I'm not gonna I'm not gonna work for you. There's other people out there that are more than receptive to remote work, but getting together on a periodic basis, that is definitely appealing to everybody, and yeah, people will carve out time for that. The one time that I was in an office setting in the last year or so, it was almost like an event because Rob's coming into the office, you know, and so we got a lot done in a very short period of time, and it was probably one of the most productive times I've ever spent in an office setting. And I think you will see more things like that with workers, because they will do their focused work while they're at home, and they will leverage space with whiteboards and various technologies to work on projects together in either the offices that they have or co-working spaces, or it could be in a villa in the mountains somewhere. There's lots of different options available for people, but the key is that intentional interactions are really going to be the buzzword of choice for companies going forward, to just from a retention perspective, establishing those connections between people, and coming up with new ways for people to collaborate.
Rob, ¿y qué sucede en este caso con con el gerente remoto, con el manager? Porque se supone que ante este nuevo contexto, el gerente no es lo mismo que un gerente presencial y también tendría que tener nuevas skills, nuevas habilidades. ¿Qué piensas acerca de esto?
I actually think it's not so much new, it's actually very old. The idea of the modern office has only been with us for just over 300, not quite 300 years. Before that, there was no office, and the first office was in England in, I believe, 1726 or 1727, and it had two purposes. A place to store large amounts of paper, and a place for people to meet. And neither of those things are necessary in 2023. We've got everything digitized. We can do calls like this, um, and people are you know learning older skills. There were, whether it was the Romans or whatever, people worked remote prior to the 1700s quite frequently. People communicated. It was asynchronous because you were sending letters. So I think a lot of this is rediscovering old skills. How do you trust people to do work when you can't watch them all the time? How do you communicate effectively over distance? And it's one of the things that I find interesting about um, Elon Musk, is that he's been one of the proponents of return to office, but at the same time, he's also pushing for us to be on Mars at some time in the near future. Now, Mars, you have to work asynchronously. You can't communicate real time because of the distance between the planet, and it changes from day to day based on the distance between the two. So you could have a 17-minute delay in sending a message to somebody. You could have a 40-minute delay in sending a message. That's assuming you don't have any, obstacles or atmospheric issues along the way. So I think a lot of this is, learning some old skills, how to have, people done this in the past, and then applying some the new technology to it to realize that, we're not working synchronously all the time. We're typically working asynchronous, uh, and that's the way that humans really prefer to operate. We've just gotten so used to technology moving things along faster and faster and faster, and eventually things broke, and now we're relearning a lot of things that we probably have forgotten from the last few hundred years.
Es muy interesante lo que describís porque es como que la gente, la comunidad se está redescubriendo en este sentido de poder recontactarse con su familia, recontactarse con sus amigos. Es como una nueva revolución en este ámbito laboral, ¿no?
And the remote work is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. It kind of reveals some of these other things. So I think you're going to see a lot more people doing more community activities. You're going to see, one of the things that I've been kind of fascinated with is just kind of the entertainment industry. Prior to 1900, at least in the United States, roughly 93% of entertainers were able to make a living wage from their craft, whether they were an actor or a singer or whatever. But as radio came along and Hollywood and the movies, things got consolidated into this studio system, and those things got consolidated. So today, the average actor or singer, only about 15% of them are able to make a living wage from their craft. Everybody else needs a primary job to pay the bills. But one of the things that I've seen during the pandemic is that a lot more local performers, street performers, a lot more of them, and I think people are discovering new ways as content creators to leverage, whether they're an artist, a singer, an actor, whatever. And yeah, it kind of expands as you go. One of the things that I've been trying to push, just kind of on the remote work um, scale in smaller communities, is that typically from an economic development perspective, the approach used to be, if you wanted to bring jobs to your community, you had to find companies that were going to move there. You don't need to do that anymore. You just need to show that you've got 5G coverage for the internet and amenities, whether it's hiking trails or lakes or, you know, um, art things in the community, and you can attract people that can work remote. I recently moved to essentially a small village. It's like 2,000 people, and you know i'm I support a couple different offices, but for me to commute to an office at this point would be over an hour if I had to go into an office, and one office is not even it's probably closer to 5 hours away. But I don't need to do that because I have the capability to, connect to anywhere. We're talking, two continents apart right now, and I actually do that relatively often now. I regularly have conversations with people in Spain or England, or it doesn't matter. As long as we can be connected, we can do stuff together.
Está la idea de que el trabajo remoto es trabajar desde casa o work from home, como se utiliza el término más en Estados Unidos, y en muchos casos se asocia con estar solo y, bueno, de ahí a temas de la soledad en el trabajo remoto. Pero en Europa y Latinoamérica también el trabajo remoto no es necesariamente estar en casa. Al contrario, es más estar en coworkings o trabajar en cafés, donde en general se puede compartir y estar mucho más activo socialmente.
I believe that remote work doesn't cause problems, it reveals them. And the issue of loneliness, that existed long before remote work. People just didn't talk about it as much. You can be lonely in an office just as well as you can be lonely at home. And I think some of those things came out more. But and again, this is why you're looking. The office kind of filled a void that traditionally was handled different ways in the past, and you're starting to see, uh, just like what I was saying with the entertainment, you're starting to see more people look for more interactions at the community level, whether it's going to classes, stuff like that. A lot of those voids were previously filled by being in the office, and now they're looking for them back in their own communities, like they were several hundred years ago. You're going to start seeing much more of a village feel to life in general, whether it's even in cities. Cities are getting away from a central downtown area that might have been just for offices, and you're going to see much more mixed use and a variety of centers across the cities. I don't know how Buenos Aires is organized, but a lot of older European cities are already set up that way. They cities grew to a certain point, and there's just an ecosystem that exists around that span based on transportation, communication, etc. And it reaches a certain point, and then you expand from there. So you'll have these multi-centered cities with multiple neighborhoods and points, much like you will in pretty much everywhere. It'll be kind of if you look at how um, cellular communications could be set up in an ideal pattern. You would start with one tower and then add another one, and eventually you'd have three. And then the series of towers grow out from that. So cities kind of work the same way. They'll have center points, and based on what's there, they can expand out to a certain distance, providing good services, interaction for people, and then another center develops from them. The problem that has happened in a lot of U.S. cities, that after World War II, a lot of cities were redeveloped to have business districts. They destroyed neighborhoods to do that. They put in highways, thinking that cars were going to be the future of transportation. And what you have now are basically dead zones in major cities because they don't function the way that, a lot of older cities that have mixed use do currently. And that's what, I'd like to see a lot of major cities in the US at least get back to. You can look at, I'm guessing Buenos Aires is kind of like this. A lot of cities in Europe never lost that feel. So you might have businesses on the first floor, you have apartments on the second and third floor or whatever. There's always people watching the streets, so it helps to control crime. When you interrupt that flow, you end up with problems. So you've got cities like San Francisco right now. They have a high occupancy problem for their offices, and they also have a high crime rate as well, because you've got voids in the community. Cities work a certain way. They're systems, just like companies are. And when you change the way it's set up, it creates problems.
Bien, Rob, ¿y habrá algún libro, algún autor, algún newsletter que vos nos puedas recomendar acerca del trabajo remoto que te haya gustado, que te haya entusiasmado?
Sure. Um, I actually, it's not specifically about remote work, but there's a book called Riding the Tiger It's by a man named Harrison Owen. It came out in, I believe, 1983. And it's about systems, because remote work, if you focus too much on it, you just kind of, you don't see the bigger picture. And remote work is just a feature of a lot of other things that are going on. And riding the tiger is about organizations that reach a certain point and can't move any further. And that's basically what you had happen, with the pandemic. It probably would have happened uh, on its own in the future, um, if it hadn't happened. But it became sort of an inflection point that technology needed to push things forward to keep things moving on a certain track. But the idea behind riding the tiger is that companies and organizations will reach a point where they have to start over. And the companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Allstate, they've made that logical jump. And in riding the tiger, what he does as an example is he holds wakes for companies and or organizations. I don't know if that translates well for Spanish, but basically memorial service basically gets everybody together and say, as of today, the company no longer exists. And then people freak out a little bit thinking that they're going to lose their jobs. And then it's like, no, no, nobody's going to lose their job. But we need to rethink what we do. And typically, in a lot of the sessions that they do, they'll put up whiteboards or butcher block paper or whatever. And through a series of self-organizing teams, they will look at the assets that the organization has, who is the customers that they support, and basically redesign the company so that it can go forward. And that is, I think, the key principle for any company at this point. They need to figure out how they're going to work in this new structure of work, this new economy, and not try to force the old ways of what they did 3 years ago onto people now. Because I deal primarily with government and government services, and one of the challenges for the types that we provide a lot of social benefits and stuff. And typically, with any government program, you've got people have to go into the office to fill out paperwork and get their benefits and that type of stuff. And during the pandemic, that wasn't safe or possible. So there were a lot of waivers that had to be filed with the government and stuff to change the way that we were doing things, um, and the participation actually went up. More people participated in the programs when when they didn't have to go into the office, because for people who are poor, you know, getting to a government office to collect a check can be an all-day experience. You've got to pack up the kids, you've got to get on public transportation, and organize your paperwork. If you can do it over your phone, you've just saved some single mother 4 hours of her day, and the participation went up. So when um, the um, the notifications came out from the government saying, okay, we're declaring the pandemic um, crisis over, a lot of the government leaders were like, okay, great, now we can get people back to the offices to do business. And like, they don't want to come back. It's not just the workers, it's the people we're serving. They want remote services as well. So that's a hard concept for certain people to accept, because it kind of goes against what they think is supposed to happen. But you see a lot more participation with remote services when you can offer them. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to improve in a couple of states, where we're trying to take some of those capabilities that existed temporarily during the pandemic and make them more readily available. So, like in New Jersey right now, we're rolling out a program that will allow about 100,000 people to do certain types of appointments over their phone, and add some additional capabilities that we didn't have during the pandemic, like the ability to upload documents and sign things. Makes for a much smoother process. And that's going to be the trend you're going to see for government services or services in general. People want to be able to um, deal with whoever they're dealing with at their point of interaction. So whether that's at home, in their car, though, people are going to want basically the businesses to come to them. Obviously there's going to be reasons to go to certain locations, but there's so much more that you can do with this. Medicine in particular. I don't know if you have problems with nursing homes closing and people waiting to be seen in hospitals, but that's a real problem in North America, both in the US and Canada. um, and by providing remote services, you can alleviate some of the backlog that currently happens, the way the current setup is. It looks like we lost.
Bien, Rob, y queríamos consultarte también acerca del papel del trabajo remoto en las instituciones públicas, ¿no? En las instituciones políticas. Vos, por ejemplo, has trabajado en el ejército, en la rama militar de los Estados Unidos. Bueno, un poco saber cuál es el papel del trabajo remoto en ese área, no solamente en la parte militar, sino en el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
The military is kind of the original remote work, you know, people. If you think about it, militaries have been, you've had generals issuing commands to their troops in the field, for thousands of years. And you basically have to trust the people on the front line, because you can't have all your soldiers come into your office to do work. It's not practical, and it just doesn't make sense based on what the mission is. So I think the military and militaries in general have had to figure this out for thousands of years, because they have been asking people to do a job that was not anywhere near where the instructions were coming from. So that, I think you've got that model to build on. The government tends to struggle with the concept of remote work, just like anybody else. On the one side, you've got at least in the United States, you've got the General Services Administration, which did a wonderful pilot program with um, co-working spaces that saved at least one agency millions of dollars a year. Alternatively, you've got certain government leaders that are in the midst of their own return to office mandates now as well, and what they're seeing is people are quitting. So they're basically shooting themselves in the foot by pushing this, and they could end up with this situation where they don't have enough people that know the job to continue, if they keep trying to force people into this model that nobody really wants. But you've got certain people that, depending on where they are in the food chain, think that returning to the office is a good thing. And now I do think offices are important, especially for a lot of work which might require security or certain functions that really shouldn't be done outside of that arena. But you really have to take a look at what's being done and what makes sense going forward, because the rules really don't apply after the pandemic. So everybody has to take a look at what they're doing and see what works. In state governments, one of the challenges that I see is a lot of states that have union agreements. A lot of them have specific space requirements in terms of how much space somebody gets when they work for an organization. Those things have stayed in place, even though a lot of agencies have gone to a remote work model. So they might be holding out 100 square feet for a person that hasn't been in the office in 2 years just because their union contract says that they still have to. So there's a lot of things at that level that need to be relooked at. Like I said, it's yeah, all the rules changed, with the pandemic, and if we still have rules in place that are from before that time frame, they really need to be looked at to see if they still apply.
Sí, exactamente. Y el trabajo remoto no solamente afecta el desarrollo inmobiliario en tanto oficinas, sino que también afecta los espacios que tienen que ver con la vivienda, porque hay una nueva manera de vivir, por ejemplo, los co-living que se están imponiendo cada vez más, está afectando también el desarrollo inmobiliario de la vida común de los ciudadanos, porque hay muchísimos trabajadores remotos que se están mudando y se están trasladando y eligen la opción de vivir en co-living, afectando lo que es el desarrollo inmobiliario, la oferta inmobiliaria para la vivienda.
Yep. Um, it's and that's There's a kind of a double-edged sword with this, because one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that a lot of people realized that they could work from anywhere, so they went to hotspots like the coast of Portugal, or South Florida, or Chiang Mai, Thailand. And it really disrupted the local economy, because you've got people coming in that are used to wages that are 4 to 5 times what the local economy is, and you've got these landlords that are like, I'm going to make some money. So rather than charging what might be $100 a month for rent on an apartment, that based on the local economy, suddenly they're charging $1,000 a month, and the foreigners are thinking that this is a bargain. But what ends up happening is they end up pricing the the real estate out of the realm of the people that lived there in the first place. This happened in Florida. It happened in Portugal, and I know in Thailand there has been a lot of conflict between the expats and the local residents over some of these issues. So it really is important for any city or town that's trying to attract remote workers. They really need to try and enforce the kind of, make the remote workers follow the same guidelines and the same pricing structure as the local economy. Argentina has probably one of the best remote working visas right now for remote workers. The key is that you still have to work for a non-Argentinian company to do that. So, um, the I know it might be tempting for landlords to want to charge foreigners more money, but eventually it ends up destroying the local economy. In Florida, for instance, Florida used to be the number one destination for retirees in the United States, and now it's not. Now it's Eastern Pennsylvania, which seems a little crazy if you know the area. But in terms of cost of living, the west coast of Florida just skyrocketed, because real estate people could get away with charging higher prices, and they basically it ruins the economy when you do that. So any civic leaders that are trying to attract a remote population, they really need to do it thoughtfully, and make sure that um, people aren't taking advantage of the fact that they could get more by charging a foreigner versus a local person. And that way you help preserve the character of the local area.
Sí, es verdad. Pero también en este momento mucha gente que está viajando y visitando y trabajando también, eligen diferentes formas de vivir, por ejemplo en los co-living, como una comunidad, pero también, pero también revolucionando el concepto de cómo es en realidad vivir en un lugar. por ejemplo el cohousing, que es más para familia. Es muy interesante este movimiento que se está desarrollando en diferentes países para establecerse en países y vivir por 3 o 6 meses o vivir en comunidad.
Yep. That is definitely a theme that is becoming more common amongst people that are working remote. And what I think you're also going to see is that your people are discovering their tribe, if you will, outside of their immediate geographic area. So I've got friends in Eastern Canada, in England, Spain, etc. And I'm probably likely to actually, if I go to visit them, I'm probably not going to get a hotel. I may actually stay with them and feel very comfortable doing that. I think you're going to see that being much more common amongst people who are remote workers that may travel to certain destinations and have connections in those communities as well. So, whether it's a co-housing situation or, always getting the same Airbnb rooms in a particular house, people are going to be establishing connections to places and not just going there as a tourist or a visitor. But
¿Y
yeah.
cómo ves, Robert, el futuro de las ciudades? ¿Cómo se van a desarrollar las ciudades, según tu opinión, en los próximos años?
Just like with towns, cities need to showcase what they have to offer, because what you're seeing, at least in U.S. cities, it's not so much. People aren't going into cities at the same rate they were to work, but they are coming in for entertainment. So they're already starting to see changes in the public transportation patterns for a lot of the major cities. So rather than coming in from 9 to 5 to work, people are coming in from 5 to 9 to go to shows and restaurants and stuff like that. Ridership is up dramatically on the weekends compared to what it has been on the past. And you're going to see cities. I don't think it's as much of a problem in your country as it is in the United States, but cities have been the place you went to work, and um, the idea of multiple use has really gotten away from a lot of major cities. So, I, as they wrestle with the problem of vacancies in office buildings, they're not going to fill them all with people who used to work in offices. They're going to start filling them with different things like um, agriculture. There are container farms that you can put in an office building that produce great fruits and vegetables. And I think you will see medical facilities, venues. A friend of mine has a nightclub that used to be in an old gun factory, and it's a really cool place. And you're going to start seeing more things like that in the United States. I don't think in Argentina you ever quite got away from the mixed use model for your cities that like the US did. So I don't know that you're going to change your character as much as ours, but with the urban development that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we created gaps in a lot of our cities, and we're going to need to kind of fill those back in, creating green spaces, more public transportation, more opportunities for people to walk, um, and more mixed use. Some of the office buildings right now will about 15% can be converted to apartments fairly easily. The problem with office buildings is that the HVAC and the plumbing doesn't always lend itself to converting to residential, but it does um, convert fairly well to things like cloud storage or battery backups and things like that. So there's a lot of other uses that it will happen, and as that does, you'll start to see a renewed ecosystem within a lot of the major U.S. cities. Your vacancy rates are so low that I think the what you have in Buenos Aires, for example, right now will pretty much what you see. Um, in the next few years. Your work from home numbers are already higher than US numbers, and you got a low vacancy rate, and over 90% of your companies have said that they plan to offer some sort of a hybrid model in the future if they don't already. So and I'm sure they're well on the way to implementing that already. So it's I don't see the character of your cities changing quite as much as it will in the U.S.
¿Y cómo podrían hacer nuestros oyentes para contactarse con vos?
Goingremotefirst.com. If you can look it up there, I'm available on LinkedIn. You can find me. I'm sure you'll have show notes that you can add, but that's probably the easiest way.
Gracias, Rob, por haber estado en La Gran Renuncia. Bien, y en esta edición de La Gran Renuncia escuchábamos a Rob Longley trazando un paisaje de lo que es el trabajo remoto, no solamente en Europa, en la parte anglosajona, por así decirlo, sino en todo el mundo. Y también quiero rescatar, Robert, esa parte en donde estuvieron hablando de las nuevas tendencias de vida, cómo vivir, ¿no? Cómo también el trabajo remoto, más allá de una nueva dinámica entre los equipos, entre las personas, ha modificado lo que se llama el real estate o el desarrollo inmobiliario, no solamente de las oficinas, como vos aclarabas en un momento, sino también de la vida diaria, porque hay gente que opta por co-livings, hay gente que opta por vivir en comunidad, entonces todo eso cambió, todo eso va mutando, y bueno, Rob realmente lo desarrolla muy, pero muy bien, y también quiero rescatar el punto donde Rob pone en duda si volver a la presencialidad realmente significa tener un equipo realmente constituido, un equipo afianzado. No por estar en una oficina presencial uno garantiza el fortalecimiento de la cultura institucional, aunque también Rob rescata los retiros, los encuentros anuales o bianuales que se puede hacer. No descarta la importancia del contacto presencial, pero tampoco la sobreestima. ¿Cómo lo escuchaste vos, Robert?
No, muy bien. El tema de la, cómo en Estados Unidos se desarrolló la parte del centro, porque no como en otros países, quizás de Europa, de Latinoamérica, que se mezclaba un poco el tema de zona residencial y centro. En Estados Unidos se caracteriza porque hay ciudades que tienen un centro que en la noche queda totalmente solo, ¿no? Porque son puras oficinas. Entonces, bueno, lo que él estaba planteando, que a la final, si se mantiene esta tendencia del trabajo remoto, los centros de las ciudades terminarían siendo como el corazón de la comunidad, donde la gente en realidad iría para recrearse, para compartir, para estar un tiempo. Y eso sería como una modificación del centro, ¿no? Como un poquito pasarlo a también residencial. Obviamente hay oficinas que se están planteando el hecho de que pasen a ser residencias también. Entonces, todo un cambio en ese sentido, ¿no? Del centro, más que todo en Estados Unidos.
Y le mandamos un saludo grande a la gente del coworking La Cañada Multiespacio. Vos sabés que el norte de la provincia de Córdoba, en la República Argentina, es un lugar ideal para venir a hacer tus retiros empresariales. También es un lugar ideal, si sos nómada digital, para venir a pasarte unos días y trabajar disfrutando del entorno, del paisaje, de las sierras y los ríos. Bueno, tenés un coworking ideal para esto, que es La Cañada Multiespacio, en un lugar tan pero tan lindo como es Villa Yardino. Te lo recomendamos. La Cañada Multiespacio tiene salón de eventos, talleres, tiene oficinas, tiene consultorios y tiene un espacio de coworking espectacular. Están ahí en Boulevard La Cañada 29, Villa Yardino, Córdoba. Tiene una alta conectividad de buena calidad, lindos escritorios, lindos espacios, muy pero muy bien hecho el diseño, así que te esperamos en La Cañada Coworking, en Boulevard La Cañada 29, Villa Yardino, Córdoba. Para comunicarte, 3548 40 90 90. 3548 40 90 90. La Cañada Multiespacio en Villa Yardino, provincia de Córdoba, en la República Argentina. Amigos, hasta aquí el episodio de La Gran Renuncia del día de hoy. Para comunicarse con nosotros, lo pueden hacer a podcastlagranrenuncia@gmail.com. Muchísimas gracias y hasta el episodio que viene. Escuchaste La Gran Renuncia, un podcast producido por Roberto Schlesinger y Cristian Curto. Si te gustó, hace clic en el botón seguir y nos vemos en el próximo episodio.